Revive my soul, oh, give me
Romans
a pure
chapter
heart to
13 and
serve
verse number
you
1.
more and
Let everyone
more
submit to the governing authorities, since there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are instituted by God. This verse often arises in discussions about how Christians should relate to government and authority. It speaks to submission as an act of faith, acknowledging that governing institutions exist as part of God's ultimate design. But it's important to unpack what Paul is and is not saying in this passage, particularly in light of history and the varied nature of governments throughout time. Governments, as Paul mentions, are instituted by God, but this does not necessarily mean that every individual leader or action taken by governing authorities is endorsed by God himself. Instead, Paul's statement reflects a general principle. The positions of authority exist because God has allowed or designed human societies to function under structured governance. But because these positions are executed by humans who are flawed, humans who are prone to corruption, governments often fail to act righteously. Even biblical history reveals the complexities of governance. Ancient Israel, governed under God's direct guidance, often strayed from his will due to poor leadership and the nation's own disobedience. How much more can we expect imperfection from secular or human-centered governments? This imperfection does not negate the principle of submission outlined in this verse. It's crucial for us to differentiate between God's allowance of governing systems and his endorsement of every individual in power. While God can and does sometimes raise specific individuals for specific purposes, we cannot assume that every leader is directly chosen by God to carry out his will. God does permit authority structures to exist and holds those in power accountable for how they use their positions. Paul's instruction to submit to governing authorities is not a blanket approval of all governments or their actions. It is a call to recognize that our submission to authority is ultimately an acknowledgement of God's sovereignty. It is an act of trust, even when we may not understand why certain leaders are in power or be in agreement. As believers, our responsibility is to model submission, not because we agree with every decision or policy, but because we trust in the God who governs all things. This does not mean we cannot critique government or call for justice when authorities act unjustly. But even in those moments, our actions should reflect humility, faith, and respect for God's ultimate order. The way we submit to authorities, especially those we may not personally support, is a reflection of our trust in God's sovereignty. It shows that we believe He is in control, working all things according to His purposes and His will, even when the governing authorities appear flawed or unjust.